In this lecture, we're going to examine World War I and how it begins, and the four major factors that actually led to the war. So you have to understand this vocab if kind of the lesson's going to make sense. And first is entente. So an entente is a non-binding agreement that countries make. It's not a treaty, it's just an agreement. Countries will say, we're going to follow, this common trade practice, or we're going to follow this common idea. Rules that all countries are going to follow. Militarism is glorification of the military. That really doesn't do it justice, though. Militarism is where a country really, all its resources, its schools, everything is tooled for the military. A militaristic country really pushes its military as one of the main reasons that the government exists. An ultimatum is just a final set of demands. So if a teacher gives you an ultimatum, they're usually saying, do this or you're going to get written up. Mobilize just means a country is preparing for war. They're just getting all their resources together. They're getting their troops in place and they're preparing for combat. And neutrality is the policy of supporting neither side. So if you have two friends in an argument and you are neutral, that means you're not supporting either friend in that argument. So generally, Europe had had a century of peace before World War I. Yes, there had been small conflicts between countries, but there hadn't been a major European-wide war since the Napoleonic Wars. But during the 1800s, rivalries begin to grow, especially because of the rise of newly formed Germany. Germany rivals Britain and France. Russia is afraid of Germany. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is afraid of Russia. The Ottomans continue to fight with a lot of countries on their borders. So these countries all distrust each other. And that gives rise to our main, M-A-I-N, reasons for World War I. One is militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So that's the M, the A, the I, and the N. And for imperialism, you can also put industrialization, which I'll add in. I'll go edit these notes. This picture really demonstrates how Europeans viewed each other during this time. You can see it's a map of Europe, but it's made up of all their different stereotypes and how their countries dress and look. And you can see that it's their armies a lot facing outward towards the different threats that they don't trust. You have the Germans and the Austrians here pointed at this big Russian guy. You have the Ottomans looking north into the Balkans. You have the Italians sitting here looking towards Austria. And it kind of summarizes the main causes. So to start with, we're going to start with the A, which is alliances. And there's two major alliances that formed during this time, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. The Triple Alliance is made up of Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, and the whole goal is to protect Germany and Italy from France. They had both been invaded by France. Germany had just beat the crap out of France in a war, so France wanted revenge. So they naturally form an alliance to protect against French aggression. It's also to protect, not protest, I'll change that to, protect Germany and Austria-Hungary from the growing power that is the Russian Empire. So it's a very, very defensive-based alliance, mostly led by Germany. From here on out, they are going to be called just the Central Powers. That's what we're going to refer to them. You won't really hear them called the Triple Alliance that much. On the other side, we have the Triple Entente. And if you remember, Entente is a non-binding agreement. So this is more of a loose confederation of nations. First, France and Russia sign a secret treaty to protect against Germany. France is worried because Germany has made allies with Italy and a lot of other people that surround it. So it naturally looks to Russia, who is also an enemy of Germany. France and Britain then sign an entente to work together because they're right across the channel from each other. And then Britain and Russia sign an entente with each other to work with each other. This kind of brings them into an alliance accidentally. And from here on out, they are going to be called the Allies. That's all we're going to call them. While those are the two main alliances, the alliance system spreads throughout the planet as different nations begin to form a web of treaties with each other. The Ottoman Empire and Germany sign a treaty with each other to work very closely, especially building a railroad. Britain pledges to protect Belgium because it's a democracy. If anybody attacks Belgium, the British will come to their aid. The Italians sign a secret treaty saying they won't attack France, essentially double-crossing Germany. Russia pledges to protect Serbia, which will go over in detail later on in the notes about why Russia decides to protect Serbia. And Britain and Japan began to form a close relationship in the Pacific. The key part of this is that these alliances make it so that a small war can blow up into a large war as everybody begins to drag their alliances in. You can see kind of the web here of who is allied with who, and then who kind of like starts the war, I guess you could say. So this activity, you should be able to identify some of the different alliances here, but this is what the map of Europe looks like during this time. We have the Central Powers located here in the center of Europe. And then we have our Entente powers, or the Allies, here surrounding the Central Powers. After alliances, we're going to go to the I, which is imperialism, industrialization. So imperialism had caused European nations to have a divide because they were all racing to get colonies, and it made them distrust each other because they were always looking at each other as a rival in the bid to get colonies. They competed industrially. Your economy was one of the ways that you projected your world power. So if your economy was more powerful than your enemies, it made you look better. Germany threatened Britain being the most powerful country in Europe, so Britain wanted to hold on to that advantage. And Germany, in turn, was worried about Russia because Russia had a huge land area. They had a lot of potential power, and Germany was worried that they were going to be overtaken. The final piece of the key is industrialized weaponry. Industrialized weaponry is kind of our modern style of warfare. You can see it, for example, in these two pictures. These countries could produce a lot of weapons. They could produce poison gas, they can produce airplanes, they can all produce machine guns. So if they do go to war against each other, it's going to be a very bad war because they're all on similar footing. Next is the M, which is militarism, and this is the glorification of their militaries. During this time period, militaries were something that a lot of countries took pride in, and there was an arms race where nations were building up their armies and navies with new weaponry as quickly as they could. The pre-World War arms race was everyone, but a couple countries stuck out. Britain and Germany were both having a naval arms race. They were trying to build up as many ships as they could because they wanted to extend and protect their colonial empires. Britain was kind of the preeminent power, naval power, but Germany was quickly threatening them. On land, it was between France, Russia, and Germany, all trying to build up massive multi-million man armies so that if there was a war, they could fight it more efficiently. This kind of, again, makes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're all trying to build up their military as quick as possible, which makes the other countries distrust them, which makes other countries build up their militaries, which makes them build up their military more, and it kind of just continues the cycle. You can see this article from Puck Magazine shows what's going on. They all are sitting on their piles of weapons, kind of playing poker with them, and everybody knows that a war is going to break out eventually. The final piece, and probably the most important, is the end of nationalism. So Europe began to have this idea that each ethnic group should have its own nation, the idea of the nation state that we went over earlier in this unit. And that causes a lot of issues because a lot of different ethnic groups ruled over other ethnic groups. So there were different revolts in a lot of those multi-ethnic empires. Furthermore, France and the French-German rivalry was all about the wars they have fought and lost and won against each other. During the last war, the Franco-Prussian War, the French had lost their territory of Alsace and Lorraine, and they want it returned because the people who live in Alsace-Lorraine are German, they're French. And who should own Alsace and Lorraine? The French. So it's kind of that pride piece. Russia began to sponsor the idea of pan-Slavism. So the Russian people are Slavic, that's their ethnic group, and most of the people living in Eastern Germany are also Slavic. And the Russians kind of saw themselves as the big brother and protector of the Slavs. So Russia wants to extend their influence to those nations, and a lot of those nations are A, either independent, or B, ruled by multi-ethnic empires who don't want the Russian influence there. So again, it's causing more and more distrust. There's also a lot of nations that are revolting in the Balkans, which is, I'll show you where that is. But they're under the rule of the Ottomans and the Austrians, and they're not Ottoman, they're not Austrian, they want their own nation. So there's a lot of like tension in Europe, and it's pretty much a powder keg that's only going to take a spark to blow up. So the area of the Balkans that I was telling you about pretty much makes up this entire area. This is called the Balkans, and it was split between the empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, and they both had a lot of influence and want to control this area. And some of these nations had broken away, but they were still kind of controlled by these two empires and did not want that. Most of those people are ethnic cousins of the Russians, so the Russians were continuing to push their influence down here and their idea of pan-Slavism. So this is why it's called the powder keg of Europe. This is an area where a war is most likely to start. There's the most conflict down here. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the future king of Austria-Hungary, is assassinated in Serbia by a Serbian nationalist who wants to get the Austro-Hungarians out of Serbia and to kind of expand Serbia's independence and borders. That obviously does not sit very well with the Austro-Hungarians. So the Austro-Hungarians send an ultimatum to the Serbians, telling them that they have to desist, they have to turn over the people who killed the Archduke, and this really angers the Serbians. But the Serbians end up giving in to most, but not all of the demands. But Austria was more so just looking for an excuse to start a war. They wanted to keep Serbia in check because Serbia had broken away from their empire and the Ottoman Empire, and Austria invades Serbia on July 28th, 1914, which is really going to kick off World War I. So the start of World War I can be kind of confusing, but it is a very linear system. Austria-Hungary invades Serbia, and the Russians, who were the guardians of Serbia, ask the Austro-Hungarians to soften their demands. The Austrians say no, they're going to punish Serbia. Russia then begins to mobilize for war. That doesn't mean it declares war against Austria-Hungary. It's just getting ready for it. They begin moving their troops to the border. They begin getting their supplies together. And Germany, who had told Austria-Hungary they would support them no matter what, gave them a blank check, declares war on Russia preemptively. They believe that the Russians were going to enter the war no matter what, so they just attack the Russians. Russia turns to France because they're allies to try and get the Germans to calm down. Germany then demands that the French stay out of the war. The French say no, and then Germany declares war on France on August 3rd. Britain and Italy initially remain neutral. Italy, because it tells the Germans, you started the war. We don't have to join you if you started the war. To avoid a two-front war, the Germans' goal is to knock France out very quickly. They don't want to be fighting somebody on their east and their west. It's trying to fight two people at the same time. It's not a good idea. To do this, Germany invades France through Belgium, but Belgium is protected by Britain, so then Britain declares war on Germany, and the whole alliance system is now into the war. I know this can be kind of confusing, but if you want to ask me about it, there's some graphics I can give you that very easily show how this war started. So you have to kind of think about this. Who started World War I? Whose fault is it that the war started? I hope this lesson kind of helped make sense of the beginning of World War I, and if you have any questions, just let me know.